In the granite hills of southeastern Africa stands a city built entirely of stone, without a single drop of mortar holding it together. Its outer wall alone required more than 1 million individually shaped blocks. At its peak, the city may have been home to as many as 18,000 people, a population on par with medieval London at the same moment in history. For nearly a century, European colonizers insisted it was physically impossible for African hands to have built it, and they invented elaborate stories about lost civilizations from the Mediterranean or the Middle East to explain it away. They were wrong, and the proof has been sitting in the ground the entire time. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, the city so significant that an entire modern nation took its name from it. Great Zimbabwe is not a legend or a folktale dressed up as history. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1986, studied and excavated by generations of archaeologists, including Shadrach Chirikure and Innocent Pikarai, whose research has been published in journals like Antiquity and forms the backbone of what we now understand about the site. The ruins sit in the watershed between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers on Zimbabwe's southern plateau, and they are recognized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Geographic, and Smithsonian-affiliated scholars alike as the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. This was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, built by the ancestors of the modern Shona people, and construction on it began around the 11th century and continued for roughly 300 years. To understand the scale of what was built here, it helps to picture something you already know. Imagine the footprint of an entire medieval town, walls and homes and workshops and public gathering spaces, and now spread that across roughly 1,800 acres, an area comparable in size to medieval London itself. Now picture the single most imposing piece of it, the Great Enclosure, a curved outer wall measuring about 250 meters in circumference and standing as tall as 11 meters in places, built from over 1 million cut granite blocks stacked without any binding agent at all. No cement, no clay, nothing but the precision of the cut stone holding the weight of itself in place. 11 meters is nearly the height of a 4-story building, and it has stood, uncemented, exposed to weather and time for more than 700 years. The city itself unfolds in 3 distinct sections, and each one tells a different part of the story. The first is the hill complex, the oldest section, dating to around 1250, built atop a granite outcrop that includes a cave still considered a sacred site by Shona communities today. This is believed to have been the residence of the ruling family, enclosed by walls 30 feet high and flanked by stone towers and monoliths carved with geometric patterns. The second section is the Great Enclosure itself, the architectural centerpiece, built later and to a noticeably higher standard of craftsmanship than the hill complex, with rectangular blocks laid in even, level courses that taper from a base up to 6 meters wide down to an apex of about 3 meters. Inside its walls sits the most mysterious structure at Great Zimbabwe, a solid, cone-shaped stone tower roughly 10 meters tall that has no doorway, no internal chamber, and no confirmed function. Archaeologists have proposed it may have symbolized a grain store, a demonstration of the ruler's ability to protect and provide for his people, since Shona tradition closely linked a leader's authority to his generosity with grain. Others have suggested it carried religious or ceremonial meaning. Nobody has definitively settled the question, and honestly, that mystery is part of what keeps researchers coming back. Even the hill complex holds its own unresolved detail. The sacred cave built into its granite outcrop has a natural acoustic property that amplifies sound outward across the valley below, and some researchers have proposed that a ruler speaking from within it could have been heard clearly by people gathered far below, effectively turning the geology itself into an instrument of political and spiritual authority, though this remains an informed interpretation rather than a settled fact. The third section is the valley ruins, and this is where the story stops being about kings and monuments and starts being about ordinary life. Spread across the lower ground surrounding the Great Enclosure, archaeologists have identified the remains of hundreds of houses built from daga, a mixture of mud and thatch, along with iron smelting furnaces, tools, jewelry, and workshops for gold and copper working. This is where the estimated population figure comes from. Based on the density and distribution of these house remains, researchers have proposed that Great Zimbabwe supported a population as high as 18,000 people at its peak, sometime in the 14th century, a number that would have made it comparable in scale to some of the larger cities in medieval Europe at the same historical moment. 1 million granite blocks. That is the figure archaeologists keep returning to when they describe the Great Enclosure's outer wall alone, not the entire city, just that one curved boundary. 1 million granite blocks, each one quarried from nearby granite outcrops, split along natural fracture lines, using fire and water rather than metal tools, then shaped and fitted by hand, so precisely that the wall has needed no repair in over 700 years. To put that labor in perspective, imagine a construction crew today, without cranes, without powered cutting tools, without cement trucks, splitting and dressing enough stone by hand to build a wall 4 stories tall and long enough to wrap around several city blocks, and then repeating that scale of effort across an entire urban complex that took roughly 3 centuries to complete. The construction technique itself evolved visibly over that time. The earliest walls at the hill complex are comparatively rough, built from irregular stones. By the time builders reached the Great Enclosure, generations later, the technique had been refined into the rectangular, evenly coursed blockwork that represents, according to researchers like Chirikure and Pikirai, the finest masonry skill demonstrated anywhere at the site. Life inside this stone framework revolved around a mixed economy that combined subsistence and prestige in ways archaeologists have only fully pieced together in recent decades. Cattle herding sat at the center of it, both as a food source and, more importantly, ASA marker of wealth and social status among Shona communities, the same role cattle played across much of pre-colonial southern Africa. Alongside herding, residents of the valley ruins farmed grain crops, smelted iron for tools and weapons, and worked copper and gold into wire, beads, and ornaments, some of which have been recovered directly from excavations at the site. This wasn't a city that produced raw gold for export and nothing else. It was a manufacturing center turning raw metal into finished goods, which is part of why archaeologists describe Great Zimbabwe less as a ceremonial capital and more as a genuine working city, with artisans, farmers, herders, and traders all occupying the same urban footprint as the royal family living above them on the hill. Here's the part that connects the architecture to the wider world. Because Great Zimbabwe was never isolated, it sat at the center of a trade network that stretched deep into the interior of the continent for gold and ivory, and reached outward across the Indian Ocean to the Swahili coast, linking through the trading city of Kilwa Kisawani off the coast of present-day Tanzania. Archaeologists excavating the site have recovered Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and other imported luxury goods, physical evidence that the wealth generated here in gold and ivory was flowing out to Indian Ocean markets and coming back as exotic goods from thousands of miles away. Great Zimbabwe rose to prominence around 1300, in part as trade shifted away from an earlier regional power called Mapungubwe, located further south at the confluence of the Shashe and Limpopo rivers, likely driven by climate change and the growing availability of gold in the hills around Great Zimbabwe itself. Mapungubwe had been the dominant trading center before it, home to roughly 5,000 people at its own height, and its decline over the course of the 13th century opened the door for Great Zimbabwe to take its place as the region's dominant power. The gold itself moved along a specific, well-documented route. Inland goldfields on the Zimbabwean plateau, funneled through Great Zimbabwe and its satellite settlements, then carried overland roughly 300 miles to the Indian Ocean port of Sofala, on the coast of present-day Mozambique, where Swahili traders shipped it northward to Kilwa and onward into the broader Indian Ocean trading world that connected East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China. At its height, the broader Zimbabwe state, made up of more than 150 smaller satellite settlements known as Zimbabwe's, is thought to have covered roughly 50,000 square kilometers, an area larger than several modern European countries combined. Now here's where it gets frustrating, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it says as much about the 19th and 20th centuries as it does about the 14th. When European explorers and colonial officials first encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 1800s, they refused, almost universally, to accept that African builders had constructed it. Cecil Rhodes and the colonial administrators who followed him actively promoted theories, crediting the ruins to Phoenicians, to the biblical Queen of Sheba, to virtually any non-African source imaginable, because the alternative, that a sophisticated Iron Age African state had engineered and governed a city of this scale, contradicted the racist justifications colonizers relied on to claim the land. This wasn't a fringe theory. It was official colonial-era doctrine, taught and repeated for decades, even as archaeological evidence accumulated that flatly contradicted it. Early excavators sympathetic to the colonial narrative, working in the early 20th century, actively disturbed and discarded archaeological layers that would have helped date the site accurately, in some cases, removing material that could have settled the question decades sooner. Later, more rigorous excavations, including work led by archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1929, found no evidence whatsoever of non-African construction. And Caton Thompson stated plainly that the architecture, artifacts, and pottery were entirely consistent with African origin. Even that clear finding did not immediately end the political resistance. Under the government of Rhodesia in the 1960s and 1970s, museum officials and civil servants faced direct pressure to avoid publicly stating that Africans had built Great Zimbabwe, because the ruling minority government considered the admission a threat to the ideological basis of its own rule. It took until well into the 20th century, and considerable pressure from professional archaeologists working against the political interests of the colonial government for the scientific consensus to be openly and officially acknowledged. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, full stop. The name of the modern country, Zimbabwe, is a Shona word meaning stone houses, a direct, permanent rebuttal chosen deliberately at independence in 1980 to the myths colonial rule had spent a century trying to enforce. Quickly, before we move further into how the city eventually emptied out, what you now know is that this was a fully realized capital city, home to a royal complex, a monumental ceremonial enclosure, and a sprawling residential valley that may have housed up to 18,000 people, all connected to an international trade network reaching China and Persia by way of the Swahili coast, and all of it deliberately misattributed for a century by colonizers who found the truth politically inconvenient. Now here's the part that connects the city's rise to its eventual, quieter ending. Great Zimbabwe was not conquered, and there's no significant archaeological evidence of warfare or violent destruction bringing the city down. What evidence exists points instead toward a slower, more environmental unraveling. Researchers studying the site's decline in the 15th and 16th centuries have proposed that the very success of the city sowed the seeds of its own limits. A population in the tens of thousands, along with the cattle herds central to Shona wealth and status, would have placed enormous pressure on the surrounding land, stripping trees for fuel and construction, overgrazing grasslands, and gradually depleting the soil and water resources the city depended on. Environmental data recovered from the region also point to a period of severe, sustained drought during roughly this window, which some researchers believe was the final push that made the site unsustainable, forcing the population to disperse and political power to migrate elsewhere on the plateau, eventually giving rise to successor states in the region. There's also a question worth sitting with here. Where did that political power actually go once it left Great Zimbabwe? The evidence points toward two major successor kingdoms. To the north, the Mutapa state rose to prominence, eventually engaging directly with Portuguese traders arriving on the East African coast in the 1500s, which is part of why some of the earliest written, though secondhand, European descriptions of the Zimbabwe Plateau's stone-building tradition come from Portuguese chronicler João de Barros, relaying accounts passed to him rather than first-hand observation. To the southwest, the Torwa and later Rosvi states rose around another major stone complex called Kami, which continued the same dry stone building tradition for centuries after Great Zimbabwe itself had emptied out. In other words, the tradition of building in stone did not die with Great Zimbabwe. Its political center simply relocated, twice to new capitals built by the same broader Shona-speaking cultural world. This is the part of the story where honesty matters more than momentum, because not everything about Great Zimbabwe is settled science, and pretending otherwise would do a disservice to the very real ongoing scholarly debate. That 18,000 person population figure, the number that gives this video its title, comes from earlier estimates based on house count density across the valley ruins, and it remains the most commonly cited figure in popular accounts of the site. But it is genuinely contested. A more recent study led by Shadrach Chirikure, applying more rigorous statistical modeling to the archaeological, ethnographic, and historical evidence together, concluded that the population likely never exceeded 10,000 people, a meaningfully smaller, though still historically significant, number. Other estimates over the decades have ranged as low as 2,000 on the conservative end and as high as 20,000 on the higher end, depending on methodology and which parts of the site are included in the count. The honest answer is that archaeologists do not have a single, universally agreed figure, and the true population at Great Zimbabwe's peak likely sits somewhere in a wide range rather than at one precise number. Similarly, the exact cause of the city's abandonment in the 16th or 17th century is still debated among specialists, with drought, resource depletion, and shifting trade routes toward the coast all cited as contributing factors, rather than any one confirmed, singular cause. There's a similar caveat worth applying to the trade network itself. It's tempting to imagine Great Zimbabwe's traders personally walking goods all the way to the coast and back, but the actual system was almost certainly more indirect. A relay of exchanges passing through intermediary communities and satellite Zimbabwe's along the route, with goods and value moving in stages rather than in single long-distance journeys. And while Chinese porcelain and Persian beads recovered at the site prove that goods from those regions reached Great Zimbabwe, there's no evidence that anyone from Great Zimbabwe ever traveled to China or Persia directly, or vice versa. The connection was real, but it was an indirect one, built through a chain of coastal and interior trading partners rather than direct contact between civilizations thousands of miles apart. What is not in dispute, and what no serious modern archaeologist contests, is who built it. The dry stone masonry techniques used at Great Zimbabwe connect directly to a broader regional tradition, visible across more than 500 smaller stone-walled sites, scattered through present-day Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, and South Africa, all part of the same architectural lineage developed by Bantu-speaking peoples on the southern African plateau. Great Zimbabwe was simply the largest, most ambitious, and most enduring expression of a building tradition that was already indigenous to the region, not an anomaly requiring an outside explanation. Today, the site carries weight far beyond archaeology. The soapstone birds carved by its original builders and unearthed in the ruins now appear on Zimbabwe's national flag, one of the most direct and visible threads connecting a modern nation to its own deep, self-built history. Walking through the Great Enclosure today, past walls that have needed no repair, no mortar, and no reinforcement in over 7 centuries, you are standing inside one of the clearest physical rebuttals in the world to the idea that African societies before European contact were simple, small-scale, or incapable of monumental achievement. Whether 18,000 people or 10,000 once filled its valley with the sound of iron smelting furnaces and cattle herds, and gold traders preparing goods for the coast, the walls themselves settle the only question that was ever really in doubt. Tell me in the comments which detail stayed with you most. The conical tower that still has no confirmed purpose, or the century of deliberate colonial denial it took before the world admitted who actually built this place.